Whose house did she think this was?
Yolanda Price walked into her mother's house on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, for months after burying her a continent away in her memory, but not yet in person, and found the hallway lined with moving boxes she had never given anyone permission to pack. The living room furniture was already gone. A rider reading "Sale Pending" had been stapled beneath the realtor's sign in the front yard, a sign Yolanda hadn't even known existed until a family friend mentioned it in passing 3 days earlier. Her sister Carmen was nowhere in the house, and the paperwork Yolanda would track down over the following 48 hours would show her own signature on documents she had never once put a pen to. What would make a woman fly home early on nothing but a bad feeling? Whose hand had actually signed those papers, and how long had it taken to learn to copy hers so closely? And when Yolanda finally found her mother's real will, buried in a filing cabinet at an attorney's office neither daughter knew still existed, what did it reveal about a decision their mother had made years earlier and never explained to either of them? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how any of this became possible, you have to go back to two very different childhoods lived inside the same house, under the same roof, by two sisters who grew into two very different lives. Carmen was 5 years older than Yolanda, and from as early as either of them could remember, she was the daughter their mother Estelle leaned on. When Estelle went through her first divorce, Carmen, only 14, picked up shifts at a neighborhood diner to help cover groceries. When Estelle went through a layoff in her late 40s, it was Carmen, by then out of college and working locally, who quietly covered a mortgage payment or two without ever mentioning it outright. Yolanda, 5 years younger, watched most of this unfold from a slight distance, old enough to understand what was happening but young enough that none of the weight of it ever fully landed on her shoulders. Yolanda left for college out of state at 18, a decision Estelle supported enthusiastically even as Carmen, in the background, absorbed one more version of the same lesson she'd been learning her whole life. That leaving was something one daughter got permission to do, and staying was something the other daughter simply did, without anyone ever formally asking her to. Yolanda didn't move back after graduation, building a career and eventually meeting Marcus, a logistics consultant whose work took the two of them overseas for long stretches at a time, a life that looked, from the outside, considerably larger than the one Carmen had built 2 miles from their mother's front door. The two sisters weren't estranged during those years, exactly, gathering for holidays when Yolanda's travel schedule allowed it, and keeping up a steady, if somewhat surface-level rhythm of calls and messages in between. Estelle made a point of visiting Yolanda overseas twice during that stretch, trips Carmen helped fund quietly out of her own savings without ever mentioning the cost, framing it each time as simply wanting their mother to see more of the world before she got too old to enjoy it, never once suggesting she might have liked to see some of that world herself. Estelle never hid her fondness for describing Carmen as the reliable one, a phrase she used warmly and often, never quite noticing how it landed on the daughter it was aimed at. Reliability, Carmen would say much later, never once translated into anything material. No help with her own mortgage during a rough stretch. No acknowledgement when she quietly covered a set of medical copays for their mother 2 winters running. No real conversation about whether the balance between the two daughters' lives was actually fair. Yolanda, for her part, always assumed the imbalance was something she'd eventually correct, some vague future point when she'd finally be settled enough to step back in and take on her share. That point never arrived before Estelle died. Estelle passed suddenly from a heart complication on a Thursday morning, the call reaching Yolanda in the middle of the night overseas, where she was 4 months into caring for Marcus's mother Gwendolyn, herself deep into a late-stage illness that made leaving her unattended, even briefly, something neither Yolanda nor Marcus was willing to risk. Yolanda spent that first horrible week torn cleanly in half, grieving a mother she couldn't fly home to bury while trying to hold together a household on the other side of the world that needed her just as urgently. Marcus, watching her unravel between 2 impossible obligations, gently urged her to stay, promising he'd manage what he could at home while she processed the loss from a distance, a decision Yolanda has never fully forgiven herself for even though she understands. Intellectually, there wasn't a version of that week where she could have done both. Carmen told her, over a strained phone call 2 days after the funeral, that everything had gone fine, that she'd handled it, that Yolanda shouldn't feel guilty about missing it. Marcus sat with Yolanda through most of that first week overseas, taking on extra hours of Gwendolyn's care himself, so Yolanda could disappear into her grief for stretches at a time. Bringing her tea, she mostly let go cold and not pushing her to talk before she was ready. He offered, more than once, to arrange for a temporary caregiver so the two of them could fly out together for even a few days, an offer Yolanda ultimately declined, telling him it felt wrong to leave his mother in a stranger's hands during what might be her final months, a decision she would revisit privately many times over the following months without ever quite deciding it had been the wrong one. Photos that surfaced later from extended family, posted without much thought to a shared family group months afterward, told a colder story than fine. A service noticeably smaller than either sister had ever imagined for their mother, sparse flowers, a handful of attendees standing awkwardly in a room built for far more people. Yolanda didn't see those photos until much later, and when she finally did, she understood them less as evidence of neglect and more as an early, quiet signal of exactly how overwhelmed and exactly how resentful Carmen already was by that point, managing everything alone while her sister stayed thousands of miles away. The weeks after the funeral moved slowly and vaguely for Yolanda, updates from Carmen arriving less and less frequently, each one thinner than the last. The estate was still being sorted. The house was in limbo while they figured things out. Whenever Yolanda pushed for specifics about the will, about the house, about what was actually happening with their mother's accounts, Carmen deflected gently but firmly, citing grief, slow paperwork, an attorney who was apparently taking forever to return calls. Yolanda, stretched thin by Gwendolyn's care and grieving in a delayed, disorienting way of her own, let the vagueness slide longer than she probably should have, trusting the sister who had always been the organized one to actually have things under control. The unraveling started with something almost accidental. A family friend, chatting with Yolanda on a video call about nothing in particular, mentioned offhand that she'd driven past their mother's house and seen a for sale sign go up in the yard. Yolanda sat with the sentence for a long moment before responding, certain she must have misheard. No one had told her the house was even being listed, let alone that it might already be under contract with someone. She called Carmen that same evening, keeping her voice deliberately even, and asked directly what was happening with the house. Carmen brushed the question off lightly, calling it just exploring options, insisting nothing had actually moved forward yet. Something in the specific way she said it, a beat too fast, a little too smooth, didn't sit right with Yolanda, and for the first time in 4 months of vague updates, she stopped simply accepting what she was told and started asking follow-up questions Carmen clearly hadn't prepared answers for. She pressed for a name, an agent, anything concrete, and Carmen, cornered, finally gave up the name Deborah Sims, adding quickly that it was just a conversation, nothing signed, nothing final. The call ended shortly after in an uneasy silence neither sister acknowledged directly. Yolanda hanging up with a knot in her stomach she couldn't yet explain, and Carmen, on the other end, sitting with the growing understanding that her sister no longer fully believed her. Trusting an instinct she couldn't fully explain, Yolanda spent the next 2 days arranging emergency respite care for Gwendolyn, apologizing repeatedly to Marcus for the sudden shift in plans, and booked a flight home without telling Carmen she was coming. She landed, drove straight from the airport to the house rather than to her hotel, and let herself in with the spare key she'd kept since college, walking into a hallway stacked with moving boxes and a living room stripped down to bare floors and wall outlines where furniture used to sit. She called the number listed on the yard sign before she'd even finished walking through the house, reaching a real estate agent named Deborah Sims, who answered warmly, clearly unaware anything about the call was unusual. Deborah confirmed, casually and without hesitation, that the house was under contract, closing in 11 days, and that both sisters were listed as co-sellers on the paperwork, each having signed the listing agreement and disclosure forms several months earlier. Yolanda told her, as calmly as she could manage while standing in her mother's gutted living room, that she had never signed anything. She had been overseas on every date Deborah was describing, thousands of miles from any office where those documents could have been signed. Deborah went quiet on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that told Yolanda she believed her immediately, before agreeing, somewhat shaken herself, to send over copies of everything with her own signature on it. Yolanda spent that evening at the dining table, papers spread in front of her, comparing the signature on the disclosure forms against her real one from an old passport renewal she'd saved on her phone. The forgery was close enough to pass a casual glance, but wrong in small specific ways only someone who had spent years quietly watching her actually sign things would know to imitate. She spent the rest of that night going through boxes in the house that Carmen clearly hadn't finished packing yet, and found, tucked inside an old accordion folder in what used to be their mother's home office, a stack of bank statements going back nearly 3 years. The withdrawals were steady and modest individually, small enough to avoid drawing attention on any single statement, but substantial in total once Yolanda laid them side by side, all of them time-stamped to periods when Carmen had held power of attorney over their mother's accounts and Yolanda had been overseas, unable to see any of it happening in real time. She sat on the floor of that office for nearly an hour afterward, surrounded by paper, doing the math over and over as though a different total might eventually appear if she added it up enough times. It never did. The withdrawals totaled just under $30,000 across the 3 years, routed each time into an account Yolanda didn't recognize, small enough month to month that their mother, in her final years, likely never noticed the pattern at all, trusting Carmen the way she'd trusted her with nearly everything else for 2 decades. Yolanda didn't go to a lawyer that night, and she didn't call the police. She sat with the documents until nearly dawn, deciding, with a clarity that surprised her, exactly how she wanted to handle what she'd found. She gathered everything herself, time-stamped photos of her passport stamps proving where she'd actually been on the dates the disclosure forms claimed she'd signed them, screenshots of her genuine signature pulled from other verified documents for direct comparison, and copies of the bank statements Carmen had apparently never expected anyone to find. Rather than going back to Deborah, whose loyalty in a deal like this would naturally lean toward keeping the sale alive, Yolanda drove the next morning to the office of Terrence Boyd, the agent representing the buyers, and laid the documents out on his desk without much preamble. She told him plainly that one of the 2 signatures on the seller's paperwork was forged, and that she could prove it in detail, and that she assumed his clients would want to know that before they closed on a property with a fraud problem sitting inside the chain of title. Terrence, unwilling to let his buyers walk into a deal with exactly that kind of exposure, brought the documents straight back to his clients that same afternoon. The buyers, understandably rattled by the idea of a contested signature anywhere near their closing paperwork, pulled out of the deal within 2 days, the sale collapsing entirely before it ever reached the closing table Carmen had clearly been counting on. Deborah called Yolanda directly once she learned the deal had fallen through, her tone considerably more careful than it had been days earlier, asking whether she should remove the listing entirely or simply pause it. Yolanda told her to take it down completely, thanking her for sending the paperwork so quickly once she'd realized something was wrong. An act of professional caution Yolanda suspected had spared her weeks of additional headache navigating an active listing while everything else got sorted out. Yolanda confronted Carmen at the house itself, boxes still stacked in nearly every room. Half the furniture already picked up by movers Carmen now had to scramble to cancel. She laid it all out without raising her voice. The forged signature, the years of quiet withdrawals, the sale Carmen had apparently assumed would close and disappear long before Yolanda ever found her way back home to catch any of it. Carmen didn't offer a clean denial. She talked instead, haltingly at first, and then with more force, about 20 years of being the one who never got to leave, the one who covered every gap their mother's life produced while Yolanda built an entire life an ocean away, praised the whole time for being brave and independent while Carmen was quietly praised for being reliable, a word that had never once translated into anything she could actually spend. "I didn't see it as stealing," Carmen said, arms crossed, refusing to look away even as her voice caught slightly. "I saw it as finally collecting on something nobody else was ever going to pay me." "You forged my name," Yolanda said. "That's not collecting a debt. That's deciding my name doesn't belong to me anymore." Carmen didn't have an answer for that particular framing, and the conversation stalled there, neither sister willing to move any closer to the other across the half-empty living room. Carmen tried, before Yolanda finally left the house that day, to shift the conversation toward the withdrawals, insisting they weren't theft so much as an informal arrangement she and their mother had discussed, vaguely, years earlier, an arrangement Yolanda pointed out existed nowhere in writing and that their mother, conveniently, was no longer able to confirm or deny. Carmen didn't push the point further once she heard how thin it sounded said out loud, and the two sisters stood in silence for a long moment before Yolanda finally turned to leave, telling Carmen only that she'd be in touch once she'd decided what came next. The final piece surfaced 3 days later, when Yolanda, still working through their mother's paperwork, found a business card tucked inside an old address book for an estate attorney neither daughter had ever heard mentioned before. Curious, she called the number, and the attorney's office, after verifying her identity, informed her that Estelle had filed an updated will there years earlier, one that had apparently never made it into whatever paperwork Carmen had been managing on their mother's behalf. The will named Yolanda sole beneficiary of the house specifically, with the remainder of the modest estate split evenly between both daughters. The attorney's file notes, which Yolanda was allowed to review, referenced a private conversation Estelle had once had in that office, describing a request Carmen had made years earlier asking for money against the house early, a request Estelle had apparently experienced as such a serious breach of trust that she rewrote her will within the month and never explained why to either daughter, choosing instead to simply let the original, more evenly split version quietly expire in a drawer, somewhere no one thought to check. Yolanda sat with that discovery for a long time before deciding whether to tell Carmen. When she finally did, at the house one final time, Carmen's reaction wasn't anger so much as a kind of hollow, delayed understanding. The realization that whatever she'd told herself about collecting a debt, she had, in the process, tried to sell something that had never actually been half hers to sell in the first place. A fact their mother had apparently decided years earlier and never once found the words to say out loud to either of them. There was no lawsuit and no arrest. Yolanda changed the locks within the week, filed the real will with the county recorder to formally establish the house as hers alone, and gave Carmen 30 days to clear out whatever she still had stored there. Carmen didn't argue the timeline. She simply started packing, quietly, the same boxes she'd once filled expecting an entirely different outcome. Marcus flew out once Gwendolyn's condition stabilized enough for a temporary caregiver to step in, arriving in time to help Yolanda unpack rather than pack, the two of them slowly moving her mother's belongings out of half-taped boxes and back into rooms that had sat stripped and echoing for weeks. Yolanda found herself, in those quiet evenings, talking to her mother more than she had in years, not out loud exactly, but in the steady, private way of someone finally allowed to sit still inside a loss she hadn't had room for until now. Gwendolyn passed peacefully a few months later, back overseas, with a hospice nurse and a rotating set of caregivers Yolanda had helped arrange remotely in the weeks before, a loss that arrived gently compared to the sudden shock of Estelle's death, though it left Marcus needing Yolanda's steadiness in turn for a while, a role reversal neither of them commented on directly, but both understood plainly. Yolanda flew back overseas one final time to help him close out his mother's affairs, a process that took considerably longer than either of them expected, and by the time they both returned home for good, nearly a year had passed since the day Yolanda first walked into that half-packed house. Carmen sold her own condo a few months later and moved out of state, a decision relayed to Yolanda secondhand through the same family friend whose passing comment about a yard sign had started all of this in the first place. The sisters haven't spoken since the house. Yolanda doesn't describe the silence as a victory when people ask her about it now. She describes it instead as the quietest kind of ending available to two people who had spent their entire lives being sorted, without ever really being asked, into the reliable one and the one who got to leave. She still keeps her mother's accordion folder in the same drawer where she found it, the bank statements inside it now beside the real will, two documents telling two very different versions of who Estelle Price actually trusted and why. Yolanda says, when she talks about it at all, that she stopped trying to reconcile the two versions of her sister, the one who covered secret medical bills without ever mentioning it, and the one who forged a signature and packed a house without waiting to see if her sister might have made it home in time. She simply lives, now, fully, in the one thing her mother left specifically to her, understanding that some inheritances aren't about money at all, but about finally being the one somebody chose to trust completely, even if neither daughter ever fully understood why until it was already far too late to ask. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Psyche Tales TV for more stories about the quiet ways families keep score for decades before anyone finally says the number out loud. And tell us in the comments whether you think Carmen deserved any part of that house at all, or whether their mother's decision, however painful, was the right one all along. Before you go, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.